I'm Elena Chen, 52, a museum curator who spent decades preserving other people's heritage, while my own family dismissed mine as outdated superstition. When I returned from a research trip to find my great-grandmother's ancestral altar, generations of sacred memories, dumped in a garbage bag by my stepmother, I felt something inside me shatter. "It was just cluttering the living room," she said with a shrug, as my father stood silently behind her. But what they didn't know was that beneath those worthless bronze incense holders and faded photographs lay artifacts worth more than their mortgage. The betrayal cut deep, but their faces when they discovered what they'd thrown away, that was just the beginning of them learning what real value looks like. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt your culture or memories dismissed by those who should protect them, like this video for more stories of heritage, respect, and the power of knowing your worth. The memory of my great-grandmother, Maylin's morning rituals still haunts me with their beauty. Every dawn, she would light 3 sticks of sandalwood incense in the bronze holders, their smoke curling upward like prayers made visible. Her jade prayer beads, worn smooth by decades of devotion, would click softly as she whispered the names of our ancestors. Each bead a meditation, each prayer a bridge between worlds. I was 7 when she first let me help arrange the offerings, fresh oranges in the wooden bowls, cups of jasmine tea still steaming, and always, the careful placement of her jade prayer beads beside the ancestral photographs. These beads carry the prayers of 4 generations, she told me in her careful English, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of protective symbols. Your great-great-grandmother held them during the crossing from Guangzhou. Your great-grandfather held them when he built his first shop in Chinatown. I held them when your grandfather was born, and when he married your grandmother. The altar occupied the eastern corner of our living room, positioned according to feng shui principles that Maylin never had to explain. She simply knew. The morning light would catch the jade beads just so, making them glow like captured moonlight. Even as a child, I understood this wasn't decoration. This was connection. This was home. Every piece had a story. The bronze incense holders, with their patina of age and use, had been wedding gifts to Maylin's grandparents. The wooden offering bowls, carved from a single piece of rosewood, had traveled across an ocean in a trunk that held everything our family owned. The photographs, in their tarnished silver frames, showed faces I'd never met, but somehow recognized the shape of my own eyes, the stubborn set of my father's jaw. After Maylin passed when I was 12, the altar became my father's responsibility. He maintained it dutifully, if not with her spiritual fervor. But I watched him sometimes, standing before it with his head bowed, and I knew he felt the weight of all those watching eyes, all those accumulated prayers. When he remarried Linda 5 years ago, I noticed the change immediately. The altar was relocated to a less prominent corner. The morning incense ritual became sporadic, then stopped entirely. Linda's discomfort was palpable whenever she passed, at a quick averting of eyes, a slight quickening of step, as if the presence of our ancestors was somehow accusatory. I should have seen this coming. The signs were all there, written in the gradual marginalization of everything that made our house a home. David Chen met Linda Morrison at a grief counseling group 3 years after my mother's death. I understood his loneliness, his need for companionship in the echoing spaces Mom had left behind. What I didn't anticipate was how Linda would view our family's heritage as competition for his attention. The changes started subtly. Linda would make small comments about updating the decor and creating a more cohesive look. The ancestral photographs in their ornate silver frames were the first casualties. "They're so formal, don't you think? Maybe we could put them in the bedroom instead." The hand-tinted portraits of my great-grandparents, their faces solemn with the weight of their journey to America, were relegated to a hallway where guests wouldn't see them. Dad went along with it, perhaps grateful for Linda's energy, her determination to breathe new life into our house. But I watched him study those empty spaces where familiar faces used to hang, and I saw the confusion in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite remember what had been there before. Linda's discomfort with our foreign traditions became impossible to ignore. She would wrinkle her nose at the incense smoke, opening windows with unnecessary force. "It's so strong," she'd say, waving her hand in front of her face. "Don't you think it's a bit much for every day?" The word everyday carried weight, the implication that our daily remembrance of ancestors was somehow excessive, somehow other. I tried to bridge the gap. During one of my visits, I spent an afternoon explaining the significance of each piece to Linda, hoping that understanding might breed respect. I told her about the silver frames, how they were actually rare 1920s Tiffany pieces that my great-grandmother had saved for months to purchase. I explained the symbolism in the arrangement, the careful balance of elements that created harmony. Linda listened politely, but I could see the glazed look in her eyes. "That's nice, Elena," she said when I finished. "But wouldn't it be simpler to just have a few photos on the mantel? More modern." Modern. The word became a weapon in Linda's arsenal. Everything about our traditions was old-fashioned or cluttered, or simply too much. She spoke of our heritage as if it were a burden rather than a gift, a relic that needed to be diplomatically disposed of rather than treasured. The final insult came when Linda suggested we streamline for their upcoming dinner party. "My book club is coming over, and I want the house to look sophisticated. Maybe we could put the altar things away for just one evening." The way she said altar things, as if our sacred space was nothing more than bric-a-brac to be shuffled around for the convenience of strangers. That night, I called my father. "Dad, you can't let her do this. This is our family's history." His voice was tired when he answered. "Elena, sometimes compromise is necessary in marriage. Linda's not asking for much, but she was asking for everything. She was asking him to erase the parts of himself that made him who he was, to pretend that for generations of struggle and triumph and faith meant nothing more than inconvenient clutter." The irony wasn't lost on me. Every day, I walked into the Metropolitan Museum of Asian Art, where my colleagues treated me as the foremost authority on Chinese cultural artifacts. My hands had catalogued thousands of pieces, bronzes from the Shang Dynasty, Ming porcelain, Qing Dynasty textiles. I could identify the maker of a piece by the subtle variations in glaze, date and artifact by the evolution of its decorative motifs, authenticate provenance through microscopic analysis. "Elena, what do you think about this acquisition?" Dr. Harrison, our department head, would ask, sliding a photograph across my desk. And I would know, instantly, whether we were looking at a museum-quality piece or an elaborate fake. My expertise was respected, sought after, even envied by curators at other institutions. Yet at home, my own family treated me like a child clinging to fairy tales. The wooden offering bowls from our altar, hand-carved from a single piece of rosewood by craftsmen whose techniques had been passed down through generations, showed the same level of artistry I authenticated daily. The tool marks, the patina, the way the wood had aged and darkened, these were signs I could read like a language. But when I tried to explain this to Linda, she saw only old wooden bowls that didn't match the dining set. Last month, I'd been promoted to Senior Curator of Asian Collections, a position that put me in charge of acquisitions worth millions of dollars. The promotion came with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and the responsibility for preserving cultural heritage for future generations. The irony was, Suffolk and I was entrusted with protecting the cultural treasures of complete strangers, while my own family's heritage was dismissed as worthless. My colleagues understood the sacred nature of these objects. When we acquired a new piece, we researched its history, its cultural significance, its place in the broader narrative of human civilization. We treated each artifact as a bridge between past and present, a tangible connection to the lives and beliefs of our ancestors. But Linda looked at our family's rosewood bowls and saw only clutter. She looked at centuries of craftsmanship and saw only old stuff taking up space. The disconnect was maddening. During staff meetings, I would present my findings with authority and confidence. "This piece shows clear evidence of late Qing dynasty artisanship," I would say, pointing to details that others might miss. "The brushwork here suggests a master craftsman, possibly from the Jingdesen guilds. The provenance is solid. We can trace it back through 3 generations of collectors," and everyone would nod, taking notes, respecting my expertise. But at family dinners, when I tried to share the same kind of analysis about our own family's pieces, I was met with polite indifference at best, and eye rolls at worst. "Elena's always been sentimental about old things," Linda would say, as if my professional knowledge was nothing more than nostalgic attachment. The real tragedy wasn't just that they didn't understand the value of what we had. It was that they didn't want to understand. I found them in the kitchen, Linda washing dishes while Dad read the newspaper at the breakfast table. The normalcy of the scene felt obscene after what I'd discovered. They looked up when I entered, Linda's face immediately defensive, Dad's eyes refusing to meet mine. "Where is it?" My voice was steadier than I felt. Where's the altar? Linda's hands stilled in the soapy water. Elena, I can explain. You threw it away. The words came out flat, factual, for generations of my family's history, and you threw it away like garbage. Dad finally looked up from his paper. Linda was just trying to. I wasn't talking to you. The sharpness in my voice surprised all of us. I was talking to the person who actually did it. Linda turned to face me, her chin raised in that way that always signaled she was about to justify the unjustifiable. Elena, you need to understand. We had the Hendersons coming over for dinner, and the living room was just so cluttered that altar took up the entire corner, and it made the whole space feel dark and cramped. Cluttered. I repeated the word like it was poison. My great-grandmother's calligraphy scroll was clutter. It wasn't even in English, Linda said, her voice rising. Nobody could read it anyway. And those old photographs, they were so depressing. All those serious faces staring at everyone. It wasn't exactly welcoming for guests. The calligraphy scroll, my great-grandfather's poetry, written in traditional characters that flowed like water across handmade paper. I'd spent hours as a child tracing those characters with my finger, learning their meanings, their music. Linda had thrown away words that were older than her entire family line in America. Those old photographs were my great-grandparents, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay calm. They came here with nothing, built a life from nothing, so that you could stand in this kitchen and call their memory clutter. Stood up, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Elena, please. Linda didn't mean any disrespect. Didn't mean any disrespect. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. She literally threw our ancestors in the garbage. Dad, how is that not disrespectful? Linda's face had gone red. I was trying to make this house feel like a home for all of us, not a museum to people who died decades ago. You don't even live here anymore, Elena. You visit maybe once a month. And you expect us to keep everything exactly the way it was when you were a child. I expected you to have basic human decency. I expected you to ask before destroying irreplaceable family heirlooms. Heirlooms. Linda's voice was incredulous. Elena, they were old dishes and some tarnished picture frames. I'm not some monster. Kept the photos there in a box in the closet. In a box. In the closet. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've tried to create a home where your father and I can move forward instead of being trapped in the past. Linda's voice was getting shrill now. I've been patient with all of this Chinese. Stop. Dad's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. Linda, stop. But it was too late. The word hung in the air between us, not heritage or tradition, or even stuff. Chinese. Said like a curse, like something dirty that needed to be cleaned away. 3 months, I said quietly. You've been planning this for 3 months, haven't you? Waiting for me to be gone long enough that you could erase everything. Linda's silence was answer enough. Dad sank back into his chair, his face gray. Elena, I'm sorry, I thought we were just making space. You were making space, I agreed. You were making space by throwing away the only things that connected us to who we are. I left the house without another word, but I didn't drive away. Instead, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, trying to process what had just happened. Then I got out and walked to the curb where 3 large garbage bags sat, waiting for pickup. The first bag was mostly household trash, kitchen scraps, used tissues, empty containers. The second held old magazines and newspapers, but the third was where my family's soul had been discarded. I untied the bag with shaking hands. The bronze incense holders were at the top, wrapped carelessly in newspaper like fish from the market. One had a small dent that hadn't been there before. Beneath them, I found the jade prayer beads scattered loose, no longer strung together in their sacred circle. Some had rolled to the bottom of the bag, mixed with coffee grounds and food waste. Mrs. Rodriguez, our neighbor for the past 15 years, came out to check her mail and stopped when she saw me kneeling on the sidewalk. Artifacts spread around me like archaeological finds. Elena, her voice was soft with concern. Mia, what happened? I couldn't speak. I just held up the broken string of prayer beads, their green surface now stained with garbage juice. She knelt beside me, her arthritic hands careful as she helped me extract piece after piece. The porcelain tea set, my great-grandmother's wedding gift from 1924, had suffered the worst damage. 2 cups were cracked beyond repair. and the delicate handle of the teapot had snapped off completely. Each break felt like a physical wound. She threw them away. I finally managed to say, "All of it." Mrs. Rodriguez made a sound of distress deep in her throat. "I know, Elena, I saw her this morning, dragging these bags out. I thought it was strange, how heavy they were. If I had known." We worked in silence for the next hour, carefully extracting each piece and laying them on a blanket I'd retrieved from my car. The brass candlesticks had survived intact, their sacred Tibetan engravings still clearly visible despite their ordeal. The wooden offering bowls bore new scratches but remained structurally sound, but some things were gone forever. The silk altar cloth that had covered the table for decades was nowhere to be found. Neither were several smaller pieces I remembered from childhood: a small bronze Buddha, a pair of jade figurines, a ceramic incense burner shaped like a dragon. "Maybe she didn't throw everything away at once," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested gently. "Maybe some pieces are inside still." I shook my head. No. I saw her face when I confronted her. This was deliberate. This was complete. The physical act of digging through garbage to rescue my family's heritage was humiliating beyond words. But worse was the realization that Linda had planned this carefully. She'd waited until I was gone for 10 days, long enough that even if I came back immediately, the garbage would have been collected. She'd counted on my ancestors disappearing forever into a landfill. By the time I finished, my hands were filthy and my heart was broken. But something else was growing in my chest, something cold and calculating. As I loaded the rescued pieces into my car, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. My eyes looked different, harder. Linda had made a miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I was sentimental about these pieces, I was weak. She'd forgotten that I was also a professional, someone who knew exactly what she'd destroyed. Monday morning, I arrived at the museum an hour early, my arms full of carefully wrapped artifacts. The conservation lab was empty, which was perfect. I needed privacy for what I was about to discover. I spread the pieces across the examination table under the bright LED lights, each one a small tragedy wrapped in significance. But as I began my professional assessment, tragedy transformed into something far more powerful: evidence. The bronze incense holders were the first revelation. Under magnification, I could see the maker's marks I'd never noticed as a child: tiny characters stamped into the base that identified them as ceremonial pieces from the Ming Dynasty. Not reproductions, not Ming, still actual Ming Dynasty bronzes, dating to the early 1600s. My hands trembled as I cross-referenced the marks in our authentication database. According to our records, similar pieces had sold at auction for between $15,000 and $25,000 each. We had 3. Jesus, I whispered to the empty lab. The jade prayer beads were next. I'd restrung them the night before, working by lamplight in my apartment, each bead a small green weight of memory. Under the museum's specialized lighting, I could see details that had been invisible in the soft glow of our living room. The carvings weren't just decorative, they were protective symbols, each one precisely rendered by a master craftsman. The jade itself was imperial quality, the kind reserved for wealthy merchant families or minor nobility. I ran the beads through our provenance software, comparing them to similar pieces in museum collections worldwide. The closest match was in the British Museum, a set acquired from a Qing Dynasty official's estate in 1923. Their beads were valued at $18,000 for insurance purposes. But mine were better. The carving was more detailed, the jade of higher quality. Conservative estimate, $20,000. The brass candlesticks with their Tibetan engravings presented a different kind of revelation. These weren't just ceremonial pieces, they were sacred objects that had been blessed by Buddhist monks. The engravings told the story in Sanskrit characters that few people could read anymore. According to our database, authentic Tibetan ritual objects of this quality were extraordinarily rare outside of monasteries. I photographed every angle, every mark, every detail. Each image was evidence of Linda's ignorance, proof of the magnitude of what she'd so casually discarded. By noon, I had preliminary valuations on 12 pieces. The total was staggering: over $100,000 in authenticated cultural artifacts. And I wasn't even halfway through the collection. Dr. Harrison stopped by the lab around lunchtime, curious about my intense focus. "Working on something interesting." "Family research," I said, which was technically true. He picked up one of the brass candlesticks, handling it with the reverence. "These pieces deserved beautiful work. 18th century Tibetan, I'd guess. Where did these come from? My great-grandmother's collection. I'm just now realizing what we have. Elena, these are museum quality. The engravings alone, this is master-level craftsmanship. You're looking at significant value here. Significant value. Linda had thrown away significant value because it cluttered her dinner party aesthetic. Dr. Harrison, I said carefully, if someone destroyed pieces like these, say, threw them in the garbage, what would that mean legally? His eyebrows rose. Are you talking about insurance purposes? Because these would need to be appraised and documented for any kind of claim. Not insurance. More like if someone had authority over these pieces and deliberately destroyed them, knowing their cultural significance. Ah, his expression grew serious. That's destruction of cultural property. Depending on the value and the circumstances, it could be a criminal matter. Why do you ask? I looked down at the fragments of my heritage spread across the examination table, just curious about the law. The silk altar cloth had been in the bottom of the third garbage bag, stained and crumpled, but miraculously intact. I'd almost missed it in my initial rescue operation, mistaking it for an old tablecloth. Now, under the conservation lab's careful lighting, I understood what Linda had tried to throw away. The textile was extraordinary. Hand-embroidered silk with gold metallic threads that caught the light like captured fire. The pattern was complex dragons and phoenixes intertwined with peonies and lotus blossoms, each motif precisely rendered in silk threads so fine they seemed to flow like water. This wasn't decorative art. This was ceremonial textile of the highest order. I'd seen similar pieces exactly twice in my career, once at the Smithsonian, once in a private collection that was eventually donated to the Met. Both had been behind glass, protected by climate control and security systems. Both had been valued in the six-figure range. The provenance research took 3 days. I traced the pattern style, the thread composition, the weaving techniques. Everything pointed to a single conclusion that made my hands shake as I typed my report: mid-18th century imperial workshop production, likely created for a wealthy merchant family's ancestral ceremonies. Great-grandmother Malin hadn't just been from a comfortable family, she'd been from wealth, real wealth, the kind that commissioned custom ceremonial textiles from imperial artisans. But the silk cloth was just the beginning of what I discovered that week. The ivory figurine of Guanyan that I'd rescued had seemed familiar since childhood, but I'd never examined it professionally. Now, under magnification, I could see the artist's signature carved into the base so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. The name made my breath catch. Chen Weimin, one of the most celebrated ivory carvers of the Qing dynasty, whose work was now illegal to trade internationally due to ivory bans. But this piece predated all modern restrictions by 2 centuries. More importantly, Chen Weiming's signed works were museum pieces, the kind that appeared in academic papers and international exhibitions. I called my colleague Sarah Kim at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Sarah, I need you to check your Chen Weiming files. I think I have a signed piece, but I want to confirm before I... Elena, stop right there. Did you just say you have a signed Chen Weiming? Those are worth. I know what they're worth. That's why I'm calling. The authentication process took 2 weeks. High-resolution photography, material analysis, comparison with documented works. When the final report came back, I had to sit down. Authenticated Chen Weiming, ivory Guanyan, circa 1720. Conservative auction estimate, $45,000 to $65,000. Museum acquisition value, potentially higher due to the rarity of signed pieces. Linda had thrown away a piece worth more than most people's annual salary. The discoveries kept coming. A lacquered jewelry box that I'd thought contained only costume pieces actually held my great-great-grandmother's dowry jewelry, genuine pearls, gold pieces hallmarked with traditional Chinese characters, jade bangles that sang with perfect pitch when tapped together. Each piece told a story of prosperity, of a family wealthy enough to invest in treasures that would travel across oceans and survive for generations. By the end of the month, I had documentation for 17 major pieces with a combined value exceeding $200,000. But the number that mattered most wasn't monetary. It was the realization that Linda hadn't just destroyed objects, she'd destroyed evidence of my family's true history, proof of our heritage's depth and significance. Malin had never spoken about her family's wealth. She'd lived simply, dressed modestly, treated her treasures as spiritual tools rather than financial assets. But now I understood why she'd been so careful about the altar's arrangement, why every piece had been positioned with such precision. She hadn't been preserving decorations, she'd been safeguarding a fortune. Mrs. Rodriguez called me on a Thursday evening, her voice heavy with the weight of neighborhood gossip. Elena Mija, I think you should know I saw your father at the bank yesterday. He looked very upset. I'd been avoiding Dad's calls for 2 weeks, still too angry to trust myself with civil conversation. But Mrs. Rodriguez's concern broke through my resolve. What do you mean, upset? He was talking to the loan officer. I heard him mention refinancing, something about payments being behind, and Elena, she was shopping at Nordstrom the same afternoon, spending money like she didn't have a care in the world. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. I drove to their house the next morning, not to confront but to observe. The lawn needed mowing, the paint on the front door was peeling, small signs of financial stress that I'd missed during my emotional visits. I found Dad in the garage, organizing tools with the kind of desperate precision that comes from needing to feel in control of something. He looked up when I entered, surprise and guilt warring across his face. Elena, I wasn't expecting Dad. Are you okay? Financially, I mean. His shoulders sagged. It's been difficult. Linda's used to a certain lifestyle, and with the economy my consulting work isn't what it used to be. Linda's consulting business had never been as successful as she'd claimed. I'd suspected for years that her expensive tastes were subsidized by credit cards and optimism rather than actual income. How bad is it? He couldn't meet my eyes. We're behind on the mortgage. The bank, they're talking about restructuring the loan, but that means higher payments. And Linda's car payment, her credit cards. He stopped, realizing how much he was revealing. The copper coin collection surfaced. In my mind, ancient Chinese coins strung together on red cord, the kind that were used for celebrations and ceremonies. I'd found them scattered in the garbage, their historical significance invisible to Linda's untrained eye. But to a collector, a complete set of Qing dynasty coins in good condition was worth serious money. Dad, those coins from the altar, ones strung together. Do you know what they were? Old money, I think. Malin used to say they were for luck. They were for luck. They were also worth approximately $8,000 to the right collector. The irony was devastating. Dad and Linda were facing financial ruin while throwing away artifacts that could have solved their immediate problems. The jade prayer beads alone were worth more than several months of mortgage payments. The ivory guanyan could have cleared their credit card debt entirely. Dad, why didn't you ask me for help? I'm doing well at the museum. I could have. I'm not taking money from my daughter. His pride was as intact as his financial situation was shattered. Besides, Linda thinks we can handle it ourselves. She's got some new business prospects, and if her book club friend comes through with that marketing contract, more optimism, more wishful thinking, while authentic treasures that could have provided real solutions lay buried in a landfill. I wanted to tell him. Every instinct screamed to reveal what Linda had thrown away, to explain that their financial salvation had been sitting right there in their living room. But something held me back, a growing sense that this revelation needed to be delivered at exactly the right moment, with maximum impact. Dad, I love you. But you need to understand what Linda did when she threw away the altar. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was Elena, please, can we not do this again? Linda made a mistake, but she was trying to help. The house does look better without all that old stuff. I finished for him. Is that what you were going to say? His silence was answer enough. The museum's genealogy database was more comprehensive than most people realized. As a senior curator, I had access to immigration records, ship manifests, and historical documentation that could trace family histories back centuries. I'd used these resources for provenance research countless times, but never for my own family. What I discovered about Malin's background changed everything. I thought I knew about our history. Chen. Malin hadn't been just another immigrant seeking a better life. According to the ship manifest from 1923, she'd traveled first class on the SS President Wilson, her passage paid by the Chen family trading company of Guangzhou. The passenger list noted her as merchant family, accompanied by household effects and cultural artifacts. Household effects, cultural artifacts. The altar hadn't been assembled over generations. It had arrived intact, a complete collection of valuable pieces that represented serious wealth. I dug deeper. The Chen family trading company had been one of Guangzhou's most successful import-export businesses, dealing in silk, porcelain, and precious objects. They'd had connections throughout Asia and maintained offices in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and eventually San Francisco. But the most shocking discovery came when I cross-referenced Malin's name with our museum's acquisition records. In 1963, the Metropolitan Museum had acquired a collection of Qing dynasty artifacts from the estate of Chen Malin, San Francisco. The acquisition notes mentioned that this was a partial donation from a larger family collection, with remaining pieces retained by the family for cultural continuance. My great-grandmother had donated pieces to the Met, pieces that were now part of the museum's permanent collection, displayed in climate-controlled cases and viewed by millions of visitors. I pulled the acquisition file, my hands shaking as I read the detailed inventory. Jade figurines, ceremonial bronzes, imperial textiles. The descriptions matched pieces I remembered from childhood. Artifacts that had once sat alongside the items now in my possession. The file contained photographs, black and white images of a younger Malin standing beside museum staff, formally dressed and dignified as she handed over treasures that were probably worth millions in today's market. The accompanying letter, written in her careful handwriting, explained her decision. These pieces belong in a museum, where they can be properly preserved and appreciated by future generations. However, I retain the family altar and ceremonial pieces necessary for continued ancestral veneration, as is our custom and responsibility. She'd been strategic about it. Keep the spiritual center intact, donate the rest for posterity and tax benefits. The ivory guanyan, the ceremonial textiles, the jade prayer beads, these weren't just valuable objects. They were the pieces she'd specifically chosen to keep for the family's continuing spiritual practices. Linda had thrown away the core of a museum-quality collection. The legal implications hit me like a physical blow. I pulled up California's cultural property laws, cross-referencing them with federal regulations about destroying heritage artifacts. The statutes were clear. Willful destruction of cultural property with historical or artistic value could constitute criminal vandalism, with penalties including restitution at fair market value. But there was more. Malin's will, which I found in the county records, specifically bequeathed all cultural and religious artifacts currently comprising the family altar to the Chen family lineage, to be maintained in perpetuity for ancestral veneration. Linda hadn't just thrown away valuable objects, she'd violated the explicit terms of a legal bequest. The altarpieces weren't David's to dispose of, they belonged to the Chen family lineage. They belonged to me. I sat in the research room until the museum closed, surrounded by documents that painted a picture of wealth, wisdom, and cultural sophistication that Linda had dismissed as clutter. My great-grandmother had been a businesswoman, a philanthropist, and a strategic thinker who'd managed to preserve her family's heritage while adapting to life in America, and Linda had stuffed that legacy into garbage bags without a second thought. Final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: the insurance records from 1963. Malin had insured the remaining altarpieces for $50,000, a significant sum in $1,963. Adjusted for inflation, that was equivalent to nearly $400,000 today. Linda had thrown away nearly $500,000 worth of cultural artifacts, but more than that, she'd destroyed the spiritual center of 4 generations of family faith. The question was no longer whether I could prove the value of what had been lost. The question was what I was going to do about it. The lacquered jewelry box had survived its ordeal better than most pieces, its glossy black surface showing only minor scratches from its time in the garbage. Inside, nestled in silk-lined compartments, lay the remnants of my great-great-grandmother's dowry pearls that still glowed with lustrous beauty, gold pieces marked with traditional Chinese characters, and jade bangles that sang with perfect pitch when I touched them together. Each piece had been appraised. The pearls alone were worth $8,000, natural freshwater pearls of exceptional quality, perfectly matched and hand-drilled. The gold pieces, tested and authenticated, carried the marks of master craftsmen from the Qing dynasty. Total value of the jewelry box contents, $12,000. Linda had thrown away my ancestors' wedding treasures, like costume jewelry from a thrift store. But as I sat in my apartment, surrounded by appraisal documents and authentication certificates, I realized that the monetary value was only part of the story. What I held in my hands was leverage, not just financial, but moral and legal leverage, that could force my family to confront what they'd done. The plan that formed in my mind wasn't about revenge, it was about education, about consequences, about forcing people who had dismissed my heritage to understand exactly what they'd lost. I started with legal research. California's cultural property statutes were comprehensive, covering everything from Native American artifacts to immigrant family treasures. The law was clear. Willful destruction of cultural property constituted vandalism, with civil penalties, including full restitution at fair market value. But there were also federal implications. The National Historic Preservation Act protected culturally significant artifacts, and destroying documented heritage items could trigger federal investigation. Mei Lin's 1963 donation to the Met had created a paper trail that established the collection's historical importance. I consulted with Margaret Chen, no relation, despite the name, an attorney who specialized in cultural property law. Her office was filled with recovered artifacts, pieces that had been stolen, sold illegally, or damaged through negligence. "Elena, what you're describing is textbook cultural property destruction," she said after reviewing my documentation. "The values you've established, combined with the willful nature of the disposal, create grounds for both civil action and criminal charges. I don't want to send anyone to jail," I said quickly. "I want them to understand what they did." Understanding and legal consequences aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, sometimes legal pressure is the only thing that creates genuine understanding. She explained the process: formal demand for restitution, documentation of cultural and financial losses. If that failed, civil action for recovery of damages. The mere threat of legal action often motivated people to take cultural destruction seriously. "But there's something else you should consider," Margaret added. "The emotional damage. The loss of irreplaceable family heritage. That's compensable too, though it's harder to quantify." The stone seal stamp had been carved from rare jade, my great-grandfather's personal name, Chop, that he'd used to sign important documents. Under magnification, I could see the precision of the carving, each character rendered with master-level skill. The jade itself was imperial quality, the kind reserved for wealthy merchants or government officials. I'd found it at the bottom of the garbage bag, covered in coffee grounds and eggshells. The disrespect was almost unbearable, but it was also perfect evidence of Linda's ignorance. She'd thrown away a piece worth $3,000 without recognizing its significance, its beauty, or its cultural importance. My approach needed to be strategic. Emotional confrontation had failed. Linda had dismissed my tears and anger as sentimental overreaction. But she couldn't dismiss legal documents. She couldn't dismiss professional appraisals. She couldn't dismiss the cold, hard reality of what her cleaning had actually cost. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Present the evidence systematically. Let the facts speak for themselves. Give them the opportunity to make things right before involving attorneys or authorities. But if they continued to dismiss or minimize what they'd done, I was prepared to escalate. Margaret had made it clear that we had a strong case, both legally and morally. I spent the evening organizing my documentation, appraisal certificates, authentication reports, historical research, legal precedents, insurance valuations. By the time I finished, I had a folder 3 inches thick documenting the magnitude of Linda's destruction. Tomorrow, I would give them one chance to acknowledge what they'd done and discuss meaningful restitution. If they refused, I would show them that cultural heritage wasn't just sentimental value, it was real value, protected by real laws, with real consequences for those who destroyed it. Mrs. Rodriguez invited me in for coffee when I knocked on her door Saturday morning. Her living room was warm and welcoming, filled with photographs of her own family, children and grandchildren, smiling from frames that covered every surface. The contrast with my family's recent history wasn't lost on me. "Elena, Mia, you look tired. This business with your father's wife, it's eating at you." "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need to ask you about what you saw the morning Linda threw everything away. Would you be willing to tell me exactly what happened?" She set down her coffee cup, her expression growing serious. Elena, I wish I had stopped her. I wish I had known what she was doing. Just tell me what you remember." It was early, maybe 7 in the morning. I was watering my plants on the front porch when I heard Linda in your father's garage. She was dragging bags, heavy ones, 3 big garbage bags. I pulled out a notebook, documenting everything. "What did you hear her say?" "She was talking to herself, the way people do when they're angry. She said," Mrs. Rodriguez paused, looking uncomfortable. she said, finally getting rid of all this Chinese junk. Should have done this years ago. The words hit like a physical blow. Junk. She'd called my family's heritage junk. Did you see what was in the bags? Not really, but when she put them by the curb, one of the bags split a little. I could see some dishes, some gold-colored things. I thought maybe it was old kitchen stuff, but Nalina, she threw away your grandmother's things, didn't she? My great-grandmother's altar, everything. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself. Dios mío, and that altar was beautiful, Elena. I remember when your great-grandmother would light the incense in the mornings, the smell would drift over to our yard so peaceful, so respectful. And when you were little, I used to see you helping her arrange the flowers and fruit. Would you be willing to write down what you saw, what you heard Linda say? Of course, Mia, but why are you going to the police? I don't know yet. But I need people to understand what really happened here. Mrs. Rodriguez's written statement was more detailed than I'd expected. She'd been watching because Linda's behavior had seemed odd, the secrecy, the early hour, the obvious weight of the bags. She'd also noted that David had left for work before Linda started her disposal project, which proved that this had been Linda's decision alone. But the most damning detail came near the end of our conversation. Elena, there's something else. About 2 weeks ago, Linda asked me if I knew anyone who bought old jewelry. She said she was cleaning out some family pieces that nobody wanted anymore. My blood went cold. Did she sell any of the altar pieces? I don't think so. I told her about that cash for gold place on Elm Street, but she said she wanted to get rid of everything at once. She seemed impatient, like she wanted it all gone quickly. The stone seal stamp flashed through my mind. Great-grandfather's name, Chop, carved from imperial jade. If Linda had sold that to a cash for gold operation, they would have melted it down without understanding its cultural or historical significance. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is very important. Do you remember exactly when she asked about selling jewelry? 2 weeks ago yesterday. I remember because it was the day after my grandson's birthday party. She came over while I was cleaning up, asked if I knew about selling old gold pieces. 2 weeks before I returned from my research trip, Linda hadn't acted impulsively. She'd been planning this disposal for at least 2 weeks, researching ways to profit from pieces she didn't understand before ultimately deciding to simply throw them away. The premeditation made everything worse. This wasn't a moment of frustration or poor judgment. This was calculated destruction of my family's heritage. Will you sign your statement? I asked. Sir. Of course, Elena. I'm so sorry I didn't stop her. If I had known what those bags contained, it's not your fault, Mrs. Rodriguez. You had no way of knowing. But Linda had known. She'd lived in that house for 5 years, seen me explain the significance of each piece, witnessed my father's daily respect for the altar. She'd known exactly what she was destroying, and she'd done it anyway. I called ahead this time. Dad, I need to speak with you and Linda together. There are some things about the altar that you need to understand. Elena, I thought we'd moved past this. We haven't moved past anything. I'll be there at 3 o'clock. Please make sure Linda is available. My hands were steady as I carried the leather portfolio into their living room. Inside were 43 pages of documentation, appraisal certificates, authentication reports, legal precedents, and insurance valuations, the weight of evidence, both moral and financial. Linda sat on the couch with her arms crossed, her body language screaming reluctance. Dad looked nervous, perched on the edge of his chair like he might need to run interference. I've spent the last month having the altarpieces professionally appraised. I began, setting the portfolio on the coffee table. I think you should know what you actually threw away. Elena, Linda interrupted. We've already discussed this. I know you're upset, but please don't speak until I'm finished. The authority in my voice surprised all of us. This wasn't the tearful, emotional Elena from our last confrontation. This was the senior curator of Asian collections, speaking with professional expertise. I opened the portfolio and pulled out the first appraisal certificate, the bronze incense holders, Ming Dynasty, circa 1620, authenticated by the Metropolitan Museum's Conservation Lab. Current market value, $75,000 for the set. Linda's face went pale. Dad leaned forward, reading over my shoulder. The jade prayer, beads, imperial quality jade with master-level carving, 400 years old. Appraised value, $20,000. I laid out certificate after certificate, each one a small explosion of reality. The ivory guanyan, $45,000. The ceremonial textiles, $85,000. The brass candlesticks, $12,000. The porcelain tea set, $15,000. This is impossible, Linda whispered. These were just old dishes and decorations. No, Linda, these were artifacts. Some of them were literally donated to the Metropolitan Museum by my great-grandmother in 1963. The pieces she kept. The ones you threw away were specifically chosen for their spiritual and cultural significance. I pulled out the gold bracelet with jade inlay, great-grandmother's wedding gift, now appraised at $18,000. This bracelet was worn on my great-great-grandmother's wedding day in 1898. It survived the journey to America, to world wars, and the Great Depression. It was thrown away because you thought it was costume jewelry. Dad's face had gone gray. Elena, I had no idea. The total value of what was destroyed exceeds $200,000. I continued, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. But the cultural value is immeasurable. These pieces connected our family to 4 generations of history, faith, and tradition. Linda found her voice. How was I supposed to know? They looked like old junk sitting in that corner. You were supposed to ask. The words came out sharp. You were supposed to show basic respect for items that clearly held meaning for our family. You were supposed to consider that maybe, just maybe, you didn't know everything about pieces that had been treasured for generations. I pulled out Mrs. Rodriguez's signed statement. According to our neighbor, you called these items Chinese junk when you dragged them to the curb. You also asked about selling pieces 2 weeks before you threw them away, which means this wasn't impulsive, it was planned. Elena, please, Dad said, his voice breaking. We can fix this. We can how, Dad? How do you fix destroying an 18th century silk altar cloth worth $85,000? How do you replace a Chen Weiming ivory carving that took a master craftsman months to complete? How do you restore jade prayer beads that carried 4 generations of family prayers? Linda was staring at the appraisal certificates like they might disappear if she looked hard enough. This can't be right. These numbers can't be right. Every appraisal was conducted by certified experts using museum standard authentication procedures. The values are conservative at auction. Some of these pieces would bring significantly more. I pulled out the final document, Margaret Chen's legal analysis. According to California cultural property law, willful destruction of heritage artifacts constitutes criminal vandalism with full restitution requirements. The federal government also takes cultural property destruction seriously, especially when the pieces have documented historical significance. What are you saying? Linda's voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying that what you did wasn't just disrespectful or hurtful. It was potentially criminal. You destroyed nearly $250,000 in cultural artifacts without permission, without consultation, and without any regard for their significance to the people who treasured them. The silence in the room was deafening. Dad stared at the appraisal certificates, his face cycling through shock, horror, and dawning comprehension. Linda looked like she was going to be sick. I didn't know, she said finally. Elena, you have to believe me. I would never have if I had known they were valuable. They were always valuable, Linda, not because of money, but because of what they meant to our family. The monetary value just makes your ignorance more expensive. The ceremonial dagger lay on the coffee table between us, its silver handle catching the afternoon light. I'd saved it for last, not because it was the most valuable piece, but because it was the most symbolic. The ritual blade had been used in family ceremonies for generations, its precious stone inlay marking it as a piece of genuine historical significance. This dagger, I said, my voice calm but implacable, was used in coming-of-age ceremonies for Chun family children. Every generation for over 200 years. The stones in the handle are rubies and sapphires, set by master craftsmen. The silver bears hallmarks, indicating royal workshop production. Linda stared at it like it might bite her. I thought it was just an old knife. You thought a lot of things, Linda, all of them wrong. I pulled out a calculator and began adding figures aloud. Bronze incense holders, $75,000. Jade prayer beads, $20,000. Ivory guanyan, $45,000. Silk altar cloth, $85,000. Porcelain tea set, $15,000. Gold and jade jewelry, $30,000. Ceremonial dagger, $8,000. Brass candlesticks, $12,000. Each number was a hammer blow. Dad winced with every addition. The total value of destroyed items, $290,000. That's more than this house is worth. That's more than most people earn in 5 years. And you threw it away because it didn't match your book club aesthetic. Elena, I'm sorry, Linda said, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. If I could take it back. Sorry doesn't restore a 400-year-old jade prayer bracelet. Sorry doesn't unbreak a Qing dynasty porcelain teapot. Sorry doesn't bring back the silk altar cloth that my great-great-grandmother embroidered by hand. I opened the legal folder. According to California Penal Code Section 594, destroying property worth more than $400 constitutes felony vandalism. When that property has cultural or historical significance, the penalties increase. Federal cultural property statutes add additional penalties for destroying documented heritage artifacts. Dad's voice was barely audible. Are you going to press charges? That depends on what happens next. I stood up, every inch the museum professional I'd trained to become. Linda, you destroyed my family's heritage because you were ignorant and arrogant. You dismissed 4 generations of sacred objects as clutter without bothering to learn their significance. You violated the trust of a family that welcomed you, and you broke laws designed to protect cultural property. What do you want from us? Linda's mascara was streaking down her cheeks. I want acknowledgement. Real acknowledgement. Not the dismissive half-apologies you've been offering. I want you to understand that what you did wasn't a mistake, it was cultural destruction on a massive scale. I pulled out the insurance documents from 1963. Great-grandmother insured these pieces for $50,000. In $1,963. That's equivalent to nearly $400,000 today. She knew their value, both cultural and financial. She protected them for 60 years, through wars and economic hardship and social change. And you undid all of that in one morning because you wanted a clean coffee table for your book club. The weight of the revelation was crushing Dad. I could see him calculating the mortgage payments they couldn't make, the credit card debt they couldn't pay, the financial crisis that these worthless objects could have solved entirely. Dad, you stood by and let her do this. You knew how much the altar meant to me, to our family's spiritual practice, to our connection, to our ancestors, and you let her throw it away without even calling to warn me. I thought it was just old things taking up space. You thought wrong. You both thought wrong. And now we have to deal with the consequences. I collected the appraisal, certificates, and legal documents, sliding them back into the portfolio. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to acknowledge, publicly, what you destroyed. You're going to apologize to the Asian American community for your cultural insensitivity, and you're going to make financial restitution for the pieces that can be replaced. Elena, we don't have that kind of money, Dad said desperately. I know. I also know you're facing foreclosure. I know Linda's credit cards are maxed out. I know. You've been lying to me about your financial situation for months. The final blow landed like a physical impact. They'd destroyed their own salvation without even realizing it. The pieces you threw away could have solved every financial problem you have. Instead, you've created a legal and moral debt that will take years to repay. Linda was sobbing openly now. What do you want us to do? I want you to learn. I want you to grow. And I want you to spend the rest of your lives making sure nothing like this ever happens again. The prayer wheel sat in my apartment now, its brass surface polished to a warm glow that caught the morning light. It was one of the few pieces that had survived Linda's disposal completely intact. A Tibetan Buddhist artifact that had been blessed by monks decades ago. Its spiritual significance as immeasurable as its monetary worth. I'd given Dad and Linda a week to process what they'd learned. Now I was back, this time with a formal proposal typed on museum letterhead. I've made a decision about the remaining pieces, I announced, setting the document on their kitchen table. The survivors, the prayer wheel, the ceremonial dagger, the brass candlesticks, and the few other intact artifacts will be donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Asian Art in our family's name. Dad looked up from the proposal, confused. Elena, those pieces are worth, I know what they're worth, but they'll be safer in a museum than in a house where they're seen as disposable decor. Linda's face crumpled. You're taking them away from us permanently. I'm ensuring they'll never be thrown away again. The museum will create a permanent display, the Chen family collection, preserving Asian American heritage. Visitors will learn about the importance of cultural preservation and the consequences of destroying irreplaceable artifacts. The proposal outlined everything: the donation process, the tax benefits, the educational component, but the most important clause came at the end. In exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges for cultural property destruction, you will both participate in cultural sensitivity training. You will volunteer at the Asian Art Museum for 6 months, learning to handle and respect cultural artifacts, and you will speak publicly about what happened here at the real cost of cultural ignorance. Elena, please, Dad said. You can't afford not to. Linda destroyed $290,000 worth of cultural property. The restitution alone would bankrupt you. This arrangement allows you to make amends through education and service instead of cash payments you'll never be able to make. I pulled out the museum's insurance valuation of the surviving pieces. The remaining artifacts are worth approximately $65,000. When donated to the museum, they'll provide a tax deduction that might help with your financial situation. It's the only value you'll ever see from these pieces, because you've proven you can't be trusted to preserve them. The irony was bitter but perfect. The family's financial crisis could be partially resolved by donating the very items Linda had tried to destroy, but only if they acknowledged their mistake publicly and committed to learning from it. There's one more condition, I continued. You'll fund a small scholarship at the local community college for Asian American students studying cultural preservation, $500 a year for 5 years. Consider it restitution for the educational value of what you destroyed. Linda found her voice. What if we refuse? Then I file criminal charges tomorrow. Cultural property destruction worth more than $400 is a felony in California. With the federal cultural heritage statutes, you could be looking at significant fines and possible jail time, plus civil restitution for the full $290,000. The choice was stark: accept responsibility and work toward redemption, or face the full legal consequences of their actions. Dad studied the proposal for a long time. The museum volunteer work. What would we be doing? Learning. You'll work with the education department, helping school groups understand the importance of cultural preservation. You'll handle artifacts under supervision, learning proper care and respect for cultural property. And you'll tell your story how ignorance and cultural insensitivity led to irreplaceable losses. It wasn't punishment, it was education with consequences, the kind of meaningful accountability that might actually change behavior instead of just imposing penalties. I need time to think, Linda said. You have 24 hours. After that, the offer expires and we proceed with criminal charges. I stood to leave, then turned back. Linda, you called our family's heritage Chinese junk. You threw away for centuries of cultural preservation because you couldn't be bothered to learn what you were destroying. This is your chance to understand what culture actually means, what it costs when it's lost. The prayer wheel would be safe in the museum, protected by climate control and security systems. Future generations would see it, learn from it, understand its significance. It would survive Linda's ignorance and Dad's complicity. But the real question was whether they would choose to survive their own choices, whether they would accept responsibility and grow from it, or continue to minimize and excuse what they'd done. 20-4 hours would tell. The meditation bells chimed softly in my apartment. As I prepared for the most difficult conversation of my life, Dad had called that morning. They would accept my proposal. The relief in his voice was palpable. But I knew the real work was just beginning. The Asian American Cultural Center had agreed to host a community forum on heritage preservation. What had started as a private family tragedy was becoming a public education opportunity, exactly what I'd hoped for. And exactly what Linda feared. Elena, I don't know if I can do this, she said when I arrived at their house. Standing up in front of people, admitting what I did. You don't have a choice. This is part of the agreement. The community needs to understand what happened and why it can't happen again. The meditation bells had been part of our family's prayer rituals for generations. Their perfect pitch created by master craftsmen who understood the spiritual significance of sound. When struck together, they produced a harmony that seemed to resonate in the soul itself. Linda had nearly thrown them away too, dismissing them as old brass bells until I'd rescued them from the garbage bag. Now they would be part of the museum display, their story told to visitors who would understand their significance even if my own family hadn't. The cultural center was packed that evening. Word had spread through the Asian American community a story of heritage, destruction that resonated with families who'd faced similar pressures to assimilate, to modernize, to abandon the traditions that connected them to their ancestors. Spoke first, presenting the facts with the professional detachment I'd cultivated over years of museum work. The audience listened in respectful silence as I described each destroyed piece, its cultural significance, its monetary value, its irreplaceable connection to family history. The total value of destroyed artifacts exceeded $290,000, I concluded, but the cultural value was immeasurable. These pieces connected our family to 4 generations of faith, tradition, and identity. They can never be replaced. Then, it was Linda's turn. She approached the podium with obvious reluctance, her hands shaking as she adjusted the microphone. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice barely audible. "I want to apologize to Elena, to her family, and to this community for what I did." The audience was silent, waiting. I threw away Elena's family altar because I was ignorant and selfish. I called their sacred objects Chinese junk because I didn't understand their meaning. I destroyed 4 centuries of cultural preservation because I cared more about my dinner party than about my family's heritage. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "I want everyone to understand this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate cultural destruction born out of prejudice and ignorance, and the consequences are permanent." Dr. Sarah Kim from the Asian Art Museum spoke next, placing Linda's actions in broader context. Cultural destruction happens when dominant cultures dismiss minority traditions as outdated or foreign. It happens when people assume that assimilation means abandoning heritage. It happens when we don't educate ourselves about the significance of what we're destroying. The forum continued for 2 hours. Community members shared their own stories, families who'd lost heirlooms to fires, floods, and cultural pressure, elders who'd watched their children abandon traditions, young people struggling to reconnect with heritage their parents had been forced to hide. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Chan, a woman in her 80s, stood to speak. "I came to America in 1962, she said in heavily accented English. "I brought my family's altar in a wooden crate. My husband said we should leave it behind, start fresh in America. But I knew that if we threw away our ancestors, we would lose ourselves." She looked directly at Linda. "Young lady, you threw away more than objects. You threw away identity. You threw away belonging. You threw away the bridge between past and future." The weight of her words settled over the room like a benediction. After the forum, people approached Linda not with anger, but with sadness. They shared their own stories of cultural loss, helping her understand that what she'd done wasn't just personal destruction, but part of a broader pattern of heritage erasure. "I had no idea," Linda said to me afterward. "I thought I was just cleaning house. I had no idea I was part of something so much bigger." "Now you know," I replied. "The question is what you're going to do with that knowledge." The ancestor tabla sat on my new altar, a simple wooden plaque bearing the names of 4 generations of Chen family ancestors. It had been the spiritual heart of our original altar, the piece that connected the living to the dead, the present to the eternal. Somehow, miraculously, it had survived Linda's disposal. Found wedged behind the garbage bag where it had fallen unnoticed, now it anchored my rebuilt altar in my apartment, surrounded by the few pieces I'd managed to save and new items I'd carefully chosen to continue the tradition. The modern incense holder wasn't antique jade or Ming Dynasty bronze, but it served the same purpose, creating a bridge between worlds, maintaining the connection that Linda had tried to sever. Dad came to see the new altar on a Wednesday evening. 6 months after the community forum, he stood before it for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. "I remember when you were 7, he said finally. "Maylin taught you to arrange the oranges in the offering bowls. You were so careful, so serious about getting it right." "I still am. I know. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." The conversation we'd been avoiding for months finally began. Dad's genuine remorse, his realization of what he'd allowed to happen, his struggle to balance his marriage with his heritage, Linda's transformation through her museum volunteer work, her growing understanding of cultural preservation, her commitment to making amends. "She's different now," Dad said. "The work at the museum, it's changed her. She comes home talking about the artifacts, their stories, the families who donated them. She's starting to understand what culture means. Understanding and respecting are different things. I know, but Elena, she's trying, really trying. She's enrolled in Mandarin classes at the community college. She's reading about Chinese history, about our family's background. She wants to learn I'd seen evidence of Linda's efforts, her careful questions about cultural practices, her respectful handling of artifacts during museum work, her genuine distress when she realized the full scope of what she'd destroyed. But trust, once broken, required time and consistency to rebuild. Dad, I need you to understand something. What happened can't happen again, ever. This altar, this practice, this connection to our heritage, it's not negotiable. It's not something that can be updated or modernized or compromised for the sake of harmony. I understand. Do you? Because you stood by and watched Linda throw away for centuries of family history. You chose her comfort over our culture. You let her call our ancestors junk and our traditions clutter. He flinched at the directness of my words. I was trying to keep peace in my marriage. You were choosing the easy path over the right path, and it cost us everything. The ancestor, Dabla, seemed to watch our conversation, the names of our forebears bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. Chen Waming, who'd built the family business in Guangzhou. Chen Daoling, who'd navigated the journey to America. Chen Malin, who'd preserved our heritage through decades of change. And now, Elena Chen, tasked with rebuilding what had been destroyed. I want to make things right, Dad said. Tell me how. By never letting it happen again. By standing up for our culture, even when it's uncomfortable. By remembering that some things are more important than keeping the peace. Linda had sent a letter, 5 pages of handwritten apology that demonstrated her growing understanding of what she'd done. She'd researched each destroyed piece, learning its history and significance. She'd written to the museum, offering to fund additional educational programs about cultural preservation. She'd even contacted Mrs. Rodriguez, apologizing for her dismissive attitude toward our traditions. But the most meaningful gesture had been her request to learn the proper protocols for ancestor veneration. She wanted to understand. She'd written not just the monetary value of what she'd destroyed, but the spiritual and cultural significance. She can learn, I told Dad, but she needs to earn the right to participate. Trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. What would those actions look like? Consistent respect, genuine interest in learning, not just performing understanding, and most importantly, protecting what remains instead of threatening it. The meditation bells chimed softly as evening light filtered through my apartment windows. My new altar was smaller than the original, built from surviving pieces and careful additions, but it served the same purpose, connecting me to my ancestors, maintaining the spiritual practices that Linda had tried to erase. Can we rebuild? Dad asked. As a family we can try, but it will be on different terms, with clearer boundaries, with respect for what can't be compromised. He nodded, understanding that reconciliation would require more than apologies. It would require fundamental changes in how our family approached heritage, culture, and the delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. The ancestor tablet would bear witness to whatever came next. The new incense holder gleamed softly in the morning light. Its modern design, a bridge between old traditions and new realities. I'd chosen it carefully, not attempting to replace the irreplaceable Ming Dynasty bronzes, but honoring their purpose while acknowledging that some losses can't be undone. 1 year after Linda's destruction of our family altar, the Metropolitan Museum of Asian Art opened its permanent exhibition, the Chen Family Collection, Heritage Preserved and Lost. The display case held the surviving pieces: the prayer wheel, the ceremonial dagger, the brass candlesticks, each one accompanied by detailed explanations of their cultural significance and the story of their near destruction. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was something unexpected, a video installation featuring Linda's testimony about cultural destruction and its consequences. Her face filled the screen as she spoke directly to visitors, her voice steady but weighted with hard-earned understanding. I destroyed nearly $300,000 worth of cultural artifacts because I was ignorant and prejudiced, she said to the camera. I called sacred objects Chinese junk because I didn't understand their meaning. I threw away for centuries of family heritage because I cared more about my comfort than about preserving irreplaceable cultural treasures. The video continued, with her explanation of the volunteer work, the cultural sensitivity training, the months of education that had transformed her understanding of what culture actually means. It wasn't comfortable viewing, but it was powerful education. My name is Linda Morrison, she concluded, and I destroyed a family's heritage through ignorance. I'm sharing this story so that others might understand the true cost of cultural indifference and choose differently. The exhibition had drawn thousands of visitors in its first year. School groups, cultural organizations, families grappling with their own heritage preservation challenges. The museum reported that it had become one of their most impactful educational displays, generating discussions about cultural respect, immigrant experiences, and the importance of preserving family traditions. My own transformation had been quieter but no less significant. The experience of nearly losing everything had clarified what truly mattered, not just the monetary value of cultural artifacts, but their role in maintaining connection across generations. My rebuilt altar was smaller but more intentional, each piece chosen for its spiritual significance rather than its antiquity. The scholarship fund Dad and Linda had established was now in its second year, supporting 3 Asian American students studying cultural preservation, museum science, and heritage protection. The recipients wrote thank you letters that Linda shared with me, young people who understood that preserving culture required both knowledge and vigilance. Linda's own journey continued. She'd completed her museum volunteer commitment but continued working with the education department, helping other families understand the importance of cultural preservation. Her Mandarin classes had progressed to intermediate level, and she'd begun researching Chinese history and philosophy with the dedication of someone making up for lost time. I can't undo what I did, she'd told me during our last conversation, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure it doesn't happen again to our family or to anyone else's. The morning ritual remained unchanged. Light the incense, arrange the offerings, speak the names of ancestors who'd carried culture across oceans and through generations. But now, the practice carried additional weight, the knowledge of how easily it could be lost, how quickly centuries of preservation could be undone by ignorance or indifference. Mrs. Rodriguez still waved to me from her garden when I visited the old neighborhood. She'd become something of a local hero, her willingness to testify about what she'd witnessed helping to establish the legal case that had forced meaningful consequences. Her own family's altar had gained new prominence in her living room, and she'd begun teaching neighborhood children about the importance of preserving cultural traditions. The real victory wasn't in the money recovered or the legal consequences imposed. It was in the conversations that had started, the awareness that had spread, the understanding that cultural preservation required active protection rather than passive assumption. Elena Chen, senior curator of Asian collections, had become Elena Chen, advocate for cultural heritage protection. The distinction mattered not just in my professional work, but in my personal mission, to ensure that what had happened to our family's altar would serve as education rather than just tragedy. The new incense holder might not have been Ming Dynasty bronze, but it served the same essential purpose: creating sacred space, maintaining connection, honoring the bridge between past and future. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the true value of cultural heritage wasn't in the age or rarity of objects, but in the continuity of practice, the preservation of meaning, the determination to pass something sacred from one generation to the next. The ancestors were still watching. The tradition would continue,